It always begins in ways that feel ordinary, almost too ordinary. A woman in her mid-40s, married for nearly 2 decades, doesn't wake up one morning expecting her entire world to change. For her, life was a rhythm she had grown used to, one made of countless small routines: preparing breakfast before her husband left for work, keeping track of household needs, remembering family birthdays, and occasionally treating herself to a quiet cup of tea in the late afternoon, when the house finally settled into silence. Her name was Aisha. To many, she was the picture of what a good wife was supposed to be: steady, loyal, attentive. She had lived by the unspoken promise that if she did her part, life would reward her with stability. Her husband, Imran, was not an unkind man in the beginning. When they first met, he was attentive, even tender. He noticed her in ways she had not been noticed before, and she remembered the way his compliments lingered with her, shaping how she saw herself. It was never an extravagant love story, no whirlwind romance or dramatic gestures, but it was consistent. For a young woman raised to believe that consistency was the foundation of a good marriage, that was more than enough. For years, they built what looked like a steady life together. They had a modest but comfortable home, 2 children who had now grown into young adults, and a social circle made up of extended family, neighbors, and a few old friends. From the outside, no one would have guessed there was anything amiss. Aisha herself would not have guessed either. She thought the way her husband sometimes grew distant or distracted was just part of how long marriages evolved. People change, routines harden, silences stretch. That's what she told herself. She had no reason to suspect something more deliberate was brewing. But small signs began appearing, almost like cracks in a wall that had stood solid for too long. Imran began coming home later, his excuses always tied to work. He was distracted at the dinner table, scrolling on his phone instead of engaging in conversation. He no longer asked about her day. At first, she didn't want to believe it was anything significant. She rationalized. He was probably tired, she thought. Men sometimes go through phases of detachment. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was just his age. Yet the unease kept growing. She noticed the way he had started paying unusual attention to his appearance. A new fragrance on his clothes, shirts she hadn't seen before, his sudden interest in going to the gym. For a man who had never cared much about such things, it felt out of place. Still, she didn't confront him. It wasn't fear that kept her silent. It was denial. Denial is, after all, a strange kind of comfort. It allows people to keep holding on to the version of reality they desperately want to believe. The truth made itself undeniable one evening when she stumbled across a message on his phone. She hadn't been snooping. It was lying unlocked on the dining table, buzzing with notifications. She reached for it almost absent-mindedly, only to find words staring back at her that no wife should ever have to read. They were affectionate messages not meant for her. The name on the screen belonged to a woman she didn't know, a younger woman, full of emoticons and casual promises of weekends together. Her heart sank in a way that made her feel physically ill, as though the ground beneath her had been pulled away. Confronting him was not easy, but she did it calmly. She had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even regret. What she received instead was a blunt truth, one that stung more than any denial could have. Imran admitted he had been seeing someone else. Not only that, he confessed he was in love with her. The words fell from his lips as if he had rehearsed them. He spoke with a finality that left no room for negotiation. Aisha remembered the quiet that followed. He didn't shout, she didn't cry. It was strangely civil, as though he was speaking about a business deal that had run its course. He told her he intended to leave, that he wanted a separation. He insisted he wasn't trying to hurt her, but of course, those words only deepened the wound. Because how do you leave the person who stood beside you through decades and claim it isn't meant to hurt? The younger woman, she later discovered, was someone he had met through his workplace, bright, ambitious in her late 20s. Aisha could almost see the appeal through his eyes, the energy of youth, the excitement of something new, the illusion of possibility. She, on the other hand, represented years of routine, of predictability, of all the ordinary things men sometimes grow blind to. That's what hurt the most, not just the betrayal itself, but the way she was suddenly reduced to an afterthought, as though her years of devotion had become invisible. The days that followed blurred into one another. She went through the motions of life, but everything felt hollow. Friends and family noticed the change. Some tried to console her. Others whispered behind her back. Society has a way of making women carry the shame of a husband's betrayal, as if it were somehow their failure. Aisha absorbed all of it quietly, refusing to break down in public. At home, though, she cried in silence, the kind of tears that leave a person drained. But here is where the story begins to shift. Because pain, when it lingers long enough, begins to transform. It doesn't always stay as raw grief. Sometimes it hardens into something steadier, something sharper. Aisha began to see things with new clarity. For the first time, she stopped measuring her worth through the lens of her marriage. She thought about the years she had given, the sacrifices she had made, and the way they had been dismissed so easily. And in that clarity, an idea began to take root. She didn't want dramatic revenge. She wasn't interested in screaming matches or in trying to sabotage the relationship. That wasn't her nature. What she wanted was calm, deliberate, undeniable justice, a way of making sure that the man who had underestimated her would come to understand exactly what he had thrown away. She wanted to reclaim herself, and in doing so, ensure that his betrayal would never feel like a triumph. Revenge, for Aisha, wasn't about destruction. It was about balance, about restoring dignity, and turning the quiet ache of betrayal into a quiet form of power. She began to plan, not with haste or bitterness, but with patience. If he had chosen to undervalue her, she would show him, and herself, what he had failed to recognize. Her calm revenge would not come overnight. It would require thought, resilience, and most importantly, restraint. And so, the transformation began. She started small, almost imperceptibly. She reconnected with parts of herself she had long abandoned. She reached out to old friends, began reading again, revisited hobbies she had once loved. She changed her wardrobe, not to compete with the younger woman, but to remind herself that she was still here, still visible. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in the shadow of her marriage. What Imran didn't realize was that leaving her had not broken her. It had awakened her. And slowly, very quietly, Aisha began to prepare the path that would lead to her revenge. Not the kind that explodes in anger, but the kind that unfolds with calm inevitability, like a truth that cannot be ignored. This was just the beginning. When betrayal settles into a person's life, it leaves behind not just pain, but also silence. The kind of silence that demands to be filled with something. For Aisha, that silence was first filled with grief, then with questions, and finally, with a clarity she had not expected. The clarity did not come in a rush. It came slowly, like morning light seeping through curtains. And with it, she began to see her life in a way she had never dared before. For nearly 2 decades, her identity had been woven tightly around her role as a wife. She had been the one who remembered the little things, the way Imran liked his tea, the brand of shirt he preferred, the way his mother expected family traditions to be followed. She had carried these details like invisible weights, telling herself this was what it meant to build a home. But now, standing alone, she realized how much of herself had been buried under those roles. The woman she used to be, curious, capable, full of dreams, had grown quiet. And now she wanted to hear her own voice again. Her revenge, she decided, would not be loud. It would not come in dramatic confrontations or public humiliations. That would be too easy, too predictable. Instead, she wanted to rebuild her life so thoroughly, so gracefully, that Imran would one day have no choice but to see what he had discarded. To her, revenge was not about destroying him. It was about outgrowing him in every way. The first step was financial independence. For years, she had managed the household, balanced budgets, stretched salaries, and made sure everything was provided for. But that skill, she realized, was not the same as earning. She had left her job long ago to raise their children, and in doing so, she had placed her trust in his career. That trust had been broken, so she decided she would no longer rely on anyone else for her stability. She began with small, practical steps. She refreshed her resume, though it felt strange at first, staring at a document that seemed frozen in time, from a version of her life she barely remembered. She reached out to an old colleague who still worked at the firm where she once had a position. The conversation was awkward in the beginning, but as she spoke, something remarkable happened. She realized her knowledge, though rusty, had not disappeared. It was still there, waiting to be sharpened. The world, of course, had changed. Technology had moved forward, workplace cultures had shifted, and she felt out of place at first. But rather than shrinking back, she leaned in. She signed up for short online courses, brushing up on skills she had forgotten and learning new ones. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she sat with her laptop, practicing, studying, writing notes. It was humbling, yes, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, she was investing in herself. Imran noticed none of this. He had already moved into a new apartment with his younger partner, parading their fresh relationship like a badge of pride. He thought of Aisha as the past, predictable, resigned, irrelevant. But while he was celebrating what he believed to be a new life, Aisha was quietly laying the foundation for hers. And she did not stop at work. She began to reclaim her health. Betrayal takes a toll on the body as much as the heart. For weeks after Imran left, she had hardly eaten, surviving on tea and whatever scraps she forced herself to swallow. But one morning, staring at her reflection in the mirror, she realized that the neglect only served to deepen his betrayal. If he had chosen someone else, the answer was not to shrink into invisibility, but to strengthen herself. So she started walking. At first, just 20 minutes around the neighborhood, her steps heavy, her chest tight. But soon the walks grew longer. She joined a yoga class at a community center, surrounded by strangers who knew nothing of her story, and she found comfort in that anonymity. In those quiet stretches and breaths, she began to feel her body again. To inhabit it not as a vessel of labor for others, but as something that belonged to her. Her wardrobe changed too, not in a flashy way, but in a deliberate one. She began buying clothes that reflected who she was now, not who she had been when she was trying to please a husband. Colors she had once avoided found their way into her closet. She cut her hair shorter, a style she had secretly admired for years but never tried because she thought he wouldn't approve. Each change was small, but collectively, they were transformative. Her children, though grown, noticed. They saw their mother not as the broken figure they had worried about in those first few weeks, but as someone quietly regaining strength. They supported her in ways that surprised her, offering encouragement, helping her navigate technology, cheering her on when she shared updates about her progress. Their presence reminded her that while one relationship had ended, others still held her with love. And slowly, the revenge began to take shape. It was not about confronting Imran directly. It was about becoming a version of herself that would make his choices echo back to him with regret. She imagined the day he might see her, thriving, confident, no longer defined by him. That thought, more than anything, fueled her. But revenge, even calm revenge, requires patience. And patience she had in abundance. She remembered all the years she had waited quietly, putting her own ambitions aside for the sake of his. Now she would use that same patience to rebuild herself piece by piece. Months passed. She secured a part-time consultancy job at first, something small but respectable. The income wasn't much, but it was hers. It gave her a sense of agency that she had almost forgotten she could feel. She learned to manage her time differently, balancing work with her new routines of self-care. She no longer rushed to prepare meals at the exact time Imran used to demand them. She no longer carried the invisible weight of catering to someone else's moods. She was free. And freedom, she realized, was the sweetest form of revenge. Imran, meanwhile, began to experience the reality of his choices. The younger woman, while lively and exciting, had her own expectations. She was ambitious, career-driven, and far less tolerant of the habits Aisha had once silently accommodated. She didn't fuss over him. She didn't iron his shirts the way Aisha used to, or remember his favorite snacks without being told. At first, this didn't bother him. He told himself it was part of the thrill of being with someone independent. But slowly, the small inconveniences added up. Aisha heard about this not directly from him, but through the quiet channels of community gossip. Mutual friends mentioned that Imran seemed tired, less cheerful than he had been in those first weeks. She listened without reacting, hiding the small satisfaction that stirred within her. She didn't need to say a word. Time itself was speaking for her. Her calm revenge was working, not through schemes or confrontations, but through contrast. By living fully, by rediscovering herself, she was creating a mirror in which Imran would one day see the truth, that he had left behind not a weak, dependent woman, but a strong, evolving one. That knowledge, when it came to him, would hurt more than any angry words ever could. And yet, this was only the middle of her journey. She had begun to find her footing, yes, but she knew the real test was still ahead, facing him directly, not with bitterness, but with the quiet power she had cultivated. That moment had not yet arrived, but she could feel it approaching, like a tide slowly rising. For now, she continued to build, one day at a time. She invested in herself, in her work, in her health, and in the simple joys she had once overlooked. Each step was steady, deliberate, purposeful, and with each step, she moved further away from the shadow of betrayal and closer to the light of her own strength. This, she thought to herself, was the essence of calm revenge. Not to destroy, but to rise. Not to shout, but to shine. And though he did not know it yet, Imran's greatest punishment was already unfolding. He had set her free, and she was using that freedom to become more than he ever imagined. Time has a way of changing not just circumstances, but also the way people see themselves. For Aisha, the months that turned into more than a year were not wasted. They were deliberate, each day adding another layer to the life she was building. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She had become someone else entirely, stronger, calmer, more aware of her own worth. Her work had grown. What began as a modest consultancy role turned into something far more significant. Word of her diligence spread, and soon she was offered a more permanent position. She found herself back in the professional world, navigating projects and deadlines with the kind of confidence she hadn't felt since her youth. This time, though, there was a difference. She wasn't doing it to impress a husband, or to fulfill someone else's expectations. She was doing it for herself. The money gave her independence, but it was never about wealth. It was about choice. She could decide where to spend, how to save, and what to invest in. She even began exploring new ventures, attending small business seminars, networking with other women who had rebuilt their lives after personal upheavals. She found a quiet community among them, women who understood betrayal and resilience, women who had stories of their own. In those connections, she found strength, and she offered it back as well. Her appearance, too, reflected this change. She carried herself differently now, with a quiet confidence that didn't need validation. Neighbors and acquaintances began to notice. Some whispered in admiration, others in curiosity. The woman who had once seemed diminished by her husband's departure now looked radiant, composed. It was not about beauty in the conventional sense. It was about presence. She occupied space with assurance. And then, inevitably, the moment came when her path and Imran's crossed again. It happened at a family gathering. Neither of them could avoid it. A cousin's wedding, an occasion where their children and extended relatives expected both parents to be present. Aisha had prepared herself quietly for this possibility. She knew it was only a matter of time before they were in the same room again. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how he would look at her. When she arrived at the wedding hall, dressed elegantly in a simple but striking outfit, heads turned. She wasn't trying to draw attention, yet she did. Conversations paused for a moment, eyes followed her. She smiled politely, greeting relatives, moving with composure. And then she saw him. Imran was standing across the hall with his younger partner. At first, she felt a pang of old hurt, like a bruise pressed unexpectedly, but then she looked closer. He did not look as radiant as he once had. His hair had thinned a little more, his eyes seemed tired. The younger woman beside him was chatting animatedly with someone else, barely acknowledging him. And in his eyes, as they met hers, she saw something unmistakable. Surprise. It was the kind of surprise that carried a hint of regret, He had expected her to look worn, diminished, perhaps even desperate. Instead, she looked stronger than he remembered, more alive than he had ever seen her. His glance faltered, as though he couldn't quite hold it. That was the first taste of her calm revenge. Silent, unspoken, but undeniable. Throughout the evening, they exchanged only brief words. Civil, polite, nothing more. She did not need to show bitterness, and that in itself unsettled him. Because bitterness would have meant he still had power over her emotions. Calmness, composure. Those told him that she had moved beyond him. And that, he realized, was something he couldn't control. But her revenge was not confined to appearances. It deepened in subtle ways as their lives continued to brush against each other, particularly through their children. Her daughter's graduation, her son's engagement. Events where they both had to attend, both had to share the role of parent. At each of these milestones, Aisha arrived as her new self, graceful, confident, independent. She spoke warmly with others, shared laughter, and carried no shadow of her past hurt in public. Imran, by contrast, seemed less steady with each encounter. The younger woman who had once filled his life with excitement was showing signs of restlessness. Their differences in age, once easy to overlook, became harder to bridge. She was focused on her career, on traveling, on building experiences for herself. He, however, was slowing down, craving the stability that he had once dismissed as boring. Mutual acquaintances noticed. Whispers began to circulate, as whispers always do, about the cracks in his new relationship. Aisha did not feed those whispers, nor did she revel in them outwardly, but inwardly she understood what they meant. He was beginning to face the truth she had already known. The thrill of something new does not last, and the stability of something real should never be underestimated. And then came the moment of reckoning. One evening, after a family function, he approached her as she was leaving. It had been years since they had spoken more than a few polite sentences. His voice was hesitant, almost unfamiliar in its vulnerability. He asked if they could talk. She agreed, not out of obligation but out of curiosity. They sat in a quiet corner of the venue, away from the crowd. He began with small talk, fumbling, as though unsure of how to bridge the distance between them. And then slowly he admitted it. He had made mistakes. He spoke of how things were not as he had imagined, how he sometimes thought back to the life he had left behind. He didn't ask for forgiveness outright, but his tone carried the weight of regret. Aisha listened calmly. She did not interrupt, did not lash out, did not even raise her voice. When he finished, she spoke with the same composure she had carried since the day she decided on her path. She told him she had moved on, not with another partner, but with herself. She told him that while she wished him peace, she had no desire to return to the life they once shared. She had built something new, something hers, and she would not trade it for the comfort of the familiar. The look on his face in that moment was her revenge fulfilled. Not anger, not gloating, just the quiet reality that he could no longer reach her. He had underestimated her strength, dismissed her worth, and now, faced with the undeniable evidence of what she had become, he felt the loss in its truest sense. Her calm revenge was complete. It had not required schemes or cruelty. It had not required her to lower herself. All it had required was patience, dignity, and the decision to rise rather than crumble. She had shown him, without needing to say it outright, that the woman he had left behind was not broken. She was reborn. In the years that followed, Aisha continued to thrive. She expanded her work, traveled to places she had once only dreamed of, and deepened her bonds with her children and friends. She carried no bitterness, only a quiet satisfaction. For her, revenge had never been about destroying someone else. It had been about reclaiming herself, about turning pain into power. And in the end, she had done exactly that. Her story reminds us that not all revenge is loud. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is calm, patient, and rooted in self-respect. Sometimes, the best way to answer betrayal is to rise above it so completely that the betrayer is left to live with their choices, while you live with your freedom. If you found Aisha's journey meaningful, I invite you to reflect on it. Share it with others who might need to hear it. And subscribe to this channel for more stories of calm revenge. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and together, we can remind each other that dignity and patience are sometimes the sharpest weapons of all.